Okay, let's get started with chapter 1 of our textbook. So chapter 1 is Introduction, Biology Today. One of the things I want to mention and start out with is that you are responsible for everything I present during my PowerPoint lectures. So I will not cover exactly everything in every chapter. The things that I don't present to you during my lecture, those things you are not responsible for. And again, you are responsible for the items or the topics that I do cover in my lecture, okay? So, biology exists all around us. The word biology refers to the study of, that's the word root ology, the study of bio, which means living things. And obviously, we live in a society, so biology is part of us and part of everything that surrounds us. So, as living, curious animals, we tend to have this innate, built-in passion for life. And biology does surround us and affects us directly or indirectly. So most of us do have this inherent, innate interest in life in one way or another. So this is a curiosity that is part of our makeup as living organisms, as humans. And we tend to experience nature and enjoy nature when we do manage to get outdoors. And it tends to lead us to explore our surroundings and to study in one way or another animals, plants, and their habitats. Even if it's just in your backyard or in a local park, or if you're lucky enough to travel into the tropics as I have, you do get an extreme appreciation and hopefully awe of the life that does surround us on this planet. So the scientific study of life is what we'll get into in this chapter and actually hopefully throughout the course. So again, biology is the study of life, and we'll focus on the scientific study of life. So what is a scientific study? What does it mean to be alive? These are very broad questions that we'll address in this chapter and throughout our class this time together. So you might think of a scientific experiment or an experiment as being an investigative thing, and it does investigate some aspect of life or just some aspect of the surrounding nature that makes life possible. And what does it mean to be alive? It's pretty straightforward to look at something and know that it's alive versus something that's dead. But in terms of the actual definition of life, we'll see that there's not a consistent definition among biologists. For example, bacteria that will make you sick, that cause infection, bacteria are living organisms. But a virus that will give you the flu, like coronavirus, for example, those organisms are actually not considered alive by most biologists. And when we get to microorganisms, we'll talk about why. So the overall process of science is a step-by-step process. So science is an approach to understanding the natural world. And in terms of scientists, science is advanced and based on observation, inquiry, testing, those sorts of things. Think of a mad scientist in the lab, right? They're working, they're studying some part of nature. So it's a search for information, usually information to explain some part of life or nature. And that information, once it's established and hopefully understood, is the bedrock or the foundation of science. One way to think of science is simply what we know about the world. So information helps us explain certain phenomena, which means certain aspects of nature. For example, why does it appear to that the climate is changing and the temperatures are rising worldwide? What's the potential information that would lead to a potential correct, hopefully, explanation as to why climate change is happening? And also to answer specific questions. For example, temperatures seem to be rising. Why? Through scientific investigations, we gather information and hopefully generate an explanation as to why temperatures are rising. Things like increased carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere or methane, things that are referred to as greenhouse gases. So continuing with this process, so the drive to understand our world or our natural world is based on two main scientific approaches. One is called discovery science, which is mostly about describing nature, the what part of nature. So for example, Jane Goodall, a famous biologist, has spent decades studying primate behavior, primarily chimpanzees. And much of what she has done is based on discovery science approach. In other words, observing their behavior in their society, the chimpanzees' behavior in society, and describing what she sees, describing what they do, and trying to interpret that and explain chimpanzee society. So that's discovery science, okay? And it is a type of another type of science, or another type of scientific approach to science is what is referred to as hypothesis-driven science, which is mostly about explaining nature. Okay, so one approach is to describe nature, what we see. Another way to develop science knowledge is to explain nature. It's like, why do we see what we see? So again, for example, climate change. Why is the climate on planet Earth changing? Okay, and one way to answer that question is through a scientific process that's called hypothesis-driven science. A hypothesis is a word in science speak. Hypothesis means an educated guess, basically. So an educated guess as to why climate change is occurring is maybe the concentration of greenhouse gases is changing in the atmosphere. So the hypothesis would be increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is explaining why the climate is changing. So then you set up an experiment to determine if that's true or not. An experiment in this case would be monitoring greenhouse gases and seeing that they have increased over the last 50, 60 years, and monitor or compare that to global temperatures, global temperature averages, and we see that those have also been increasing over the years. So in this hypothesis-driven science explaining nature approach, the why, in the sense of why is global temperature increasing, appears definitely linked to increases of atmospheric greenhouse gases. Okay, so two basic approaches. Discovery science, where you're describing nature, and hypothesis-driven science, where scientists are trying to explain nature. And again, most scientists do practice a combination of both of these forms of inquiry. It's not always strictly discovery science or hypothesis-driven science. It's often a combination of both of them. So for example, Jane Goodall, in her describing nature approach, she might see some behavior, and then she might jump into hypothesis-driven science, explaining nature approach, in the sense of trying to explain why do chimpanzees groom each other often. Okay? So it's usually a combination of both of these forms of inquiry. So with discovery science, science seeks natural causes for natural phenomena. In other words, scientists don't spend their time exploring supernatural causes. Like, let's say, climate change. Most scientists aren't going to say, well, climate change is caused by ghosts or by UFOs or by aliens, because based on science, we haven't shown that ghosts really exist or that aliens really exist. They may exist, but science has not shown that they do. Okay? So this does limit the scientific approach to the studies of structures and processes that can be verifiably observed. In other words, the things that we know do exist are the things that we study as scientists. And they're usually things that you can directly measure or indirectly measure with tools, like, say, a microscope to look at microscopic things, or things that you can see with the naked eye, like this frog. A scientist might say, this frog is red and some yellow and it's black and it's very easily spotted visually in nature. Why? And if you guys know anything about amphibians or frogs, their skin can secrete toxic substances. So what this frog is doing, in terms of explaining the what, its coloration, and getting to a scientific approach, an explanation of the why, is this coloration is indicating that this frog is poisonous, so it's a warning coloration to prevent things from eating it, to prevent predation. Okay? And again, the example here with these different imagery of the same ciliated protists, something called paramecium, we use tools to investigate things that are hard to see with the naked eye, like a light micrograph picture that you would use from a light microscope in the lab. This is a scanning electron micrograph or picture that actually uses electrons to create an image, highlighting the surface features, or a transmission electron micrograph, TEM, that is really good at highlighting internal structures. So again, science is not going to spend time or effort or, really importantly, money investigating things that are considered supernatural, like UFOs. Again, science hasn't shown that UFOs don't exist, but science really hasn't shown that they do exist. So this guy, if you ever heard of him, right? Not saying that it was aliens, but it was aliens. Again, reputable scientists are not going to spend their time studying things that are not verifiable. Okay, more on discovery science. So recorded observations, notice the notebook, are called data. And they could be sentences, they can be numbers. For example, how many times did she see grooming behavior in a 24-hour period? It might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Wow. Okay, so that's data that gets collected. And scientific inquiry is based on data, information. This dependence of science is on data that tends to be verifiable. In other words, the reason scientists make copious notes and record their data is that when they do come to conclusions and then report their data, like in articles, the data has to be verifiable so that other scientists can evaluate the data and say, yes, that's a really good study, your technique was really good, your data is verifiable, we agree with your findings. Okay? So that helps demystify nature and helps us explain and understand nature and hopefully preserve nature. And that again distinguishes science from supernatural concepts. Okay? So continuing, so verifiable observations or measurements are the data, the numbers of discovery science, the what, right? How many birds were found in a particular area, okay? Or how many dead birds were found in a particular area? What were their sizes? What were their colorations? What were their species? Were they male? Were they female? Okay? Different tortoises, different sizes, different shapes of their shells on different islands in the Galapagos Islands. That's the informational data of discovery science. Okay? So Charles Darwin's descriptions of the diverse plants and animals that he observed in South America during his famous voyage of discovery on the HMS Beagle was the observational data that he observed later on and he evaluated later on when he got back to England and he was able to use that data in his descriptions to come up with numerous theories and hypotheses, like the theory of evolution. And again, Jane Goodall's decades of observing and recording chimpanzees' behavior in Africa, in the country of Tanzania. Again, copious amounts of data that she was able, and others were able to analyze and help interpret and understand chimpanzee behavior.